The fork was still spinning when it hit the floor. Charles Whitmore, my fiancé's father, a man who measured worth in firm handshakes and family pedigrees, just stood there frozen mid-breath. Across from him, Colonel Mason, the veteran in full dress uniform, raised his hand in a sharp salute. His voice was steady, calm, the kind of authority that silences a room. "Sir," he said, eyes cutting through the tension like glass, "you should stand when addressing her. She's the reason my platoon came home." For a moment, no one moved. I remember the sound of the rain against the windows, and the way Charles's face drained of color. He'd spent his whole life commanding respect, and in a single sentence he realized he'd been talking down to someone who didn't need his approval. To understand how it came to that, how a polite dinner invitation turned into a reckoning, you'd have to go back an hour earlier, to a road slick with rain, and a decision I didn't think twice about. I was driving toward the Whitmore estate, my nerves already taut. Meeting the parents, the first official dinner. Evan, my fiancé, had warned me. "They're old-fashioned, Lena. Just be patient." I told him I would. I'd been patient all my life. Then I saw her, hazard lights flashing on the shoulder, a woman in uniform kneeling beside a flat tire, rain hammering her back. Without thinking, I pulled over. My jacket was soaked before I even reached her. She looked up, surprised, relief flickering across her face. "I'm fine," she said. But her hands were trembling from the cold. Together we wrestled with the tire, mud splattering everywhere. It wasn't glamorous, but it was instinct. You don't drive past someone in uniform, not when you've worn one yourself. By the time I got back in my car, the clock mocked me. I was late. My hair was ruined. My hands were streaked with dirt. Still, I couldn't regret it. Some things matter more than punctuality. When I arrived, the Whitmore mansion looked like a museum, everything polished, curated, sterile. Margaret, his mother, smiled the kind of smile that says, "I've already judged you." Charles stood near the fireplace, perfectly pressed suit, the weight of his approval hanging in the air. "You made a terrible first impression," he said, eyes traveling down to the mud on my cuffs. "My daughter deserves a man who's punctual." Evan shifted beside me, voice small. "Dad, it's not—" But Charles waved him off. Margaret poured wine as if to soothe the embarrassment. I stood there, dripping and silent, forcing a smile I didn't feel. Inside, though, something cold settled in me. He thought he was talking to some late, careless woman, an inconvenience at his table. He had no idea he was scolding someone trusted with lives, missions, and secrets he couldn't even imagine. Dinner at the Whitmores always felt like a performance, just not one I'd auditioned for. Charles, my fiancé's father, a man who wore his success like a badge of divine favor, liked to talk about pedigree. His son, Evan, had gone to the right schools, interned at the right firms, and now held a job that required cufflinks instead of courage. I, on the other hand, was the woman who worked with her hands. That's how they put it. A police officer, Charles once said with a smile too sharp to be kind. Noble work, of course, but dangerous, and not exactly elegant. His wife, Margaret, always chimed in to soften the blow, but her version of softness was salt in disguise. "At least Evan's job comes with dry cleaning, not mud," she laughed, swirling her wine. They thought they were being charming, worldly. I smiled, said nothing, let their laughter roll over me. It was easier that way. They didn't know the difference between service and servitude. And I wasn't about to explain it. They saw me as a civil servant, someone with a badge, maybe a clipboard, certainly not a clearance. They didn't know about the reinforced doors I walked through every morning, the retinal, scans, the silent hum of machines decoding the world's most dangerous whispers. They didn't know that when I left home in plain clothes, I was stepping into the nerve center of national security. In that world, I wasn't Elena the girlfriend. I was Captain Rivers, Signals Intelligence Division, Level 5 clearance, attached to Special Operations Command. The stakes were never dinner invitations or social standing. They were measured in lives, in seconds, in decisions that couldn't be undone. I remember the static of the comms headset pressed against my ear, the low voice of my field commander crackling through. Alpha Team, confirm intercept on code Echo 5. My pulse stayed steady. Rivers. Initiate data lock. Protocol, Phoenix active. My fingers moved before thought caught up. Patterns, anomalies, transmissions. It all fell into place, like a map folding open in my mind. Later, my commanding officer, General Hale, once said, "You see patterns no one else does." That's not analysis, Captain. It's intuition trained to precision. I didn't tell him that sometimes I wished my parents, or anyone, had ever said something close to that. The contrast between those two worlds was a study in hypocrisy. In one, I coordinated intelligence streams that could redirect an entire operation. In the other, I was told to relax and smile more, while men who'd never held a weapon critiqued my posture. I'd sit at that dinner table, nodding at small talk about golf clubs and property values, and think about the encrypted chatter I'd analyzed that morning, terror networks, troop movements, lives balanced on my decisions. Charles often liked to remind me that men like him built this country. I thought about the soldiers who bled for it, the analysts who burned their eyes out, on satellite feeds, the unseen people who actually held the structure together. But I never said that. I'd learned early on that truth, in the wrong room, just sounds like arrogance. Margaret had her own version of judgment, delivered with a polished smile. "You work too much, dear. Evan needs someone who'll be present. You can't build a future on a government paycheck." She said it like advice, but it landed like dismissal. I nodded again, but my thoughts were sharp beneath the calm. They measured worth by wealth. I measured it by impact. I'd spent years learning to decode encrypted transmissions, but decoding people like them? That took longer. And when I finally did, I stopped translating. I decided I'd speak their language instead. Power. Results. Public recognition. After that dinner, something in me went still. Not broken, just still. I realized that words wouldn't save me. Not explanations, not defense, not the truth. People like Charles didn't hear words. They measured worth in displays. Of power, the kind that came with titles, medals, and applause. So, I made a choice. I'd stop trying to prove my value through conversation. I'd let the system, the same one he dismissed as bureaucratic nonsense, speak for me. A week later, a notice appeared in my classified inbox, the date of the upcoming commendation ceremony. Normally, guests were limited to next of kin or command-approved civilians. But there was always a line in the protocol, a clause allowing for community recognition of external contributors. I hovered over that phrase for a long time, a faint smile tugging at my lips. That was my entry point. When I submitted the request, I kept my tone formal, precise. "Colonel Hale," I wrote, "I'd like to extend invitations to my fiancé's parents under the Community Recognition Clause. They've been supportive." It wasn't a lie, just selective truth. Hale didn't ask questions. He'd seen that same quiet fire in me before. The approval came back less than an hour later, marked simply, "Request granted." I still remember sitting in the dim light of the operations center, the screen glowing pale against my hands. The cursor blinked beside the field labeled Authorized Guest Submission. I typed slowly, deliberately, Charles Whitmore, Civilian Corporate Consultant, RET, then Margaret Whitmore, Civilian Spouse. I stared at those names for a moment. The irony felt sharp enough to taste. They would be entering a world they'd mocked, a place where every salute carried more integrity than all their dinner table lectures combined. In the days leading up to the ceremony, I said nothing. Evan told me his father was excited about the invitation. Apparently, Charles had been bragging to his golf buddies, saying they were finally recognizing me for all the influence I've had on that girl. I just smiled. Let him think that. Let him rehearse his smug handshake for the generals he thought he'd impress. Sometimes, silence is the loudest setup. They thought they were attending a community awards ceremony. In reality, they were walking into a classified recognition event, where every word spoken was recorded, every rank saluted, and every truth documented. The base looked different that night. Colder, sharper, like the air itself carried ceremony. The Whitmores arrived in their finest. Margaret draped in pearls, Charles in a suit so polished it reflected the security lights. I watched from a distance as they handed over their IDs at the checkpoint, expecting smiles, maybe a red carpet. Instead, the guard examined their badges, then gestured them through metal detectors. The smugness wavered for the first time. Their world of dinner tables and social ladders didn't prepare them for this. 1. A place where titles didn't come from inheritance, but from service. Inside the auditorium, the hum of uniformed bodies filled the space. Flags lined the walls, medals glinted beneath the lights, and whispers carried the electric reverence of people who understood sacrifice. The Whitmores took their seats near the front, close enough to feel important, but far enough not to recognize the weight of what surrounded them. Charles leaned toward Margaret, whispering something that made her laugh softly. I could almost hear it. Quite the production, isn't it? Then the lights dimmed. General Hale, a man whose presence could quiet a battlefield, stepped to the podium. His voice was deliberate, each word heavy with meaning. Tonight, he said, we honor individuals whose work remains unseen, whose impact is measured not in applause, but in lives saved. The room fell into silence, the kind that feels sacred. He began reading the account of a classified mission. Operation Meridian, he said, was nearly compromised. A convoy, 23 soldiers, trapped and cut off. Until an unidentified analyst intercepted enemy comms, rerouted satellite access, and created a corridor for extraction. I saw Charles lean toward Margaret again, murmuring, "Sounds impressive. Whoever she is." The arrogance was still there, but it was starting to sound defensive, uncertain. Then Hale's voice changed. Louder now. Clearer. For exemplary service in intelligence operations and field coordination. For the analysis that directly saved the lives of Colonel Mason and his platoon. We recognize Captain Elena Rivers, United States Army, Special Operations Intelligence Command. The room gasped. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. Charles froze mid-breath, eyes widening as if the air had turned to glass. I rose from my seat, uniform crisp, medals pinned in precise alignment. Every movement measured, calm, deliberate. Years of discipline condensed into a single moment. And then, as if the universe wanted punctuation, Colonel Mason, the same veteran I'd stopped to help that night in the rain, stood up beside the stage. His voice carried across the room. "That's her," he said, pointing toward me, "the woman who stopped for me on the highway." I didn't know I was being helped by a legend. The applause started slowly. One pair of hands, then another, until the entire auditorium was on its feet. Salutes rose like a wave. I walked past the Whitmores, their eyes following me in stunned silence. Charles tried to straighten his tie, as if formality could rebuild dignity, but it couldn't. Every salute, every "yes, ma'am," echoed the lesson he'd spent his life preaching, but never truly understood. When I reached the stage, General Hale handed me the medal with a faint nod of respect. The metal was cold against my skin, but the moment burned hot. I turned to face the audience, my peers, my commanding officers, my real family, and spoke clearly. Respect isn't inherited. It's earned, often in silence. It wasn't just a line. It was the truth of my life distilled into 12 words. The applause that followed didn't feel like validation. It felt like recognition. The kind I'd never gotten at a dinner table, or from parents who measured love by pride, not understanding. As I stood there, I caught Charles's gaze. His expression was unreadable, part disbelief, part something smaller, heavier. For years, he'd lectured me about discipline, about what it meant to serve, about the kind of people who really make a difference. And in that moment, as the room stood at attention for me, he finally understood. For years, he'd lectured me about discipline and service. In the end, he learned the difference between commanding respect and standing at attention. When the ceremony ended, the room buzzed with applause, but the Whitmores didn't stay for it. They left in silence, eyes down, shoulders stiff, the sound of their shoes swallowed by the hum of conversation around them. I watched them from the corner of my eye as they slipped through the crowd, no longer the loudest people in the room. For once, they didn't know what to say, and maybe silence was the only apology I'd ever get from them. Evan hesitated before following them out. He turned to me, face pale, words tangled in regret. "I didn't know, Lena," he whispered. "I swear I didn't know." I believed him. But belief didn't erase the truth. It only made it heavier. I met his eyes and said quietly, "Now you understand why I was late." It wasn't anger. It was closure. He nodded, speechless, then walked away to catch up with his parents. As the last of the guests left, Colonel Mason approached me. His handshake was firm, his expression soft. "The uniform doesn't make the soldier," he said. "But it sure helps the arrogant recognize one." I smiled. He understood more in one sentence than the Whitmores had in a lifetime. A year passed, and the noise of that night faded into memory. Life had changed, but not in the ways that make headlines. I'd been promoted to Major Rivers, division lead for SIGINT operations, Meridian Group. My days were quieter, my authority deeper. The plaque on my office door wasn't just a title, it was a testament to every moment I'd been dismissed, overlooked, or told to stay in my lane. My team was small, precise, loyal. They didn't see rank when they looked at me. They saw reliability. People who understood the cost of trust don't take it lightly. Together, we ran briefings that decided missions, safeguarded lives, and rewrote protocols. There were no applause breaks here, no proud parents in the front row. But there was purpose, and that was enough. Sometimes, between briefings, I'd think about the Whitmores. Not with bitterness, but with a strange kind of gratitude. They'd tested the edges of my patience, yes, but they'd also reminded me why humility and strength should never be traded for approval. Their world was still polished and hollow. Mine was heavier, but real. Then one afternoon, as I sorted through secure correspondence, an unexpected message appeared in my personal inbox. The sender's name stopped me. Charles Whitmore. The subject line read, "We misjudged you." I opened it slowly, scanning the short, stiff lines. "If you're ever in the area, we'd like to talk." That was it. No apology, no reflection, just the faintest gesture toward understanding. I stared at the screen for a long time. I didn't feel anger, just distance, the kind that comes when you've outgrown the need for validation. I hovered over reply for a moment, then smiled faintly and clicked archive. Some things don't need an answer. Later that evening, I stood on the tarmac as the last rays of sunlight stretched across the airfield. The wind tugged at my uniform, carrying the scent of jet fuel and rain. A transport plane lifted off in the distance, the same unit I'd once helped save. I raised my hand in salute, a quiet acknowledgement that the work never really ends. They thought respect came with status. I learned it comes with service and silence. You don't tell people who you are. You let your work remind them. If you've ever been underestimated, judged by appearances, or told your service didn't matter, Share your story below. This community honors quiet strength, unseen battles, and victories that speak for themselves.